I would like to give a warm welcome to everybody who is following us in this second edition of the Emerging Markets, Emerging Multinationals Research Network webinar series. I'd like to say a few words about the initiative. The Emerging Multinationals Research Network is a community of scholars, of entrepreneurs, policymakers, and educators, whom since 2015 have joined forces to provide solutions to the unique challenges that people and organizations face in the specific context of emerging economies. On this occasion, we will have an impressive lineup. I would like now to give the word to Miroux, who is a member of the Emerging Markets Emerging Multinationals Research Network, is going to present the panelists and the participants in this session. Just before giving the word to Anne, I'd like to mention that the academic professors who are with us today are Lourdes Casanova, who is the director of Emerging Market Institute at Cornell, and Miroux, who is the faculty fellow at Cornell. We have with us Moacir Miranda, a founding member of EMRN from the USP in Brazil. He's the head of business administration department. We have with us Anabela Davila, a professor at EGADE Business School and Tec de Monterrey. We have with us as well Diego Finkelstein from Universidad de San Andrés and Fernanda Caen. Welcome, everybody. Anne?
Thank you very much, Veneta, for this introduction. And basically, this seminar is part of a series of seminars that the Research Network, the Emerging Multinational Research Network, and I will say EMRN in the future, is organizing largely to discuss the impact of COVID in an emerging market perspective. So perhaps quickly how we will proceed. We will have our two speakers that I will introduce in a moment, and following each talking for about 15 minutes. And following the presentation, we will have a question and answer session led by Moacir de Miranda, who was just introduced by Veneta. And at the end, a few concluding words by Lourdes Casanova. Now, as I said, this seminar, the objective is to discuss some of the problematics of issues related to the impact of COVID on emerging markets largely. So in this context, we will have our first speaker, who is Humberto Luiz Ribeiro. And Humberto will deal with basically entrepreneurship, innovation, and digital transformation under uncertainties, the uncertainties created by the COVID crisis. Humberto combines a very rich experience as an entrepreneur and as a government official. He has started and operated a number of enterprises and ventures in IT and biotech, among others, and worked in, almost all continents, I would say, because it's Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Humberto also brings with him his experience as a government official. He has had a prestigious position in the Brazilian government because he was the Secretary of Commerce and Services of Brazil between 2011 and 2014. And interestingly, he promoted a number of policies and initiatives specifically to promote entrepreneurship in Brazil. And among his many functions, he has also been Vice President for Development, Innovation, and Foreign Trade in the National Confederation of Services. So now, Humberto, I'm giving you the floor.
Thank you so much, Professor Miroux, for the generous introduction. I'd like to start by thanking Professor Lourdes Casanova, my dear professor since 1999, back in Fontainebleau in INSEAD, a person who has always upheld the flag for Latin America and development and entrepreneurship. So once again, it's a pleasure to be sharing this with you, Lourdes. Professor Moacir, also a very good friend, and with all the ecosystem from the University of São Paulo, who's proudly one of the best universities in this part of the world. Also, the whole people from Cornell University, university that has hosted me for a visiting scholarship. And I'm very proud to be considered part of that community since 2014. University of São Paulo, Los Andes, San Andrés, and the Tecnológico de Monterrey. Hello and welcome to everybody. Very pleased to share this session with Dr. Tim Heyman. And we have the opportunity for a short discussion a few minutes ago, and I guess it's going to be a very complimentary a session with different points of view. But it's very important today to start by mentioning the appreciation and thanks to all the ones that from the healthcare and other areas of service are dedicating their lives to save ours today. So there are many people risking their lives and putting efforts to cope with the challenge that the whole global community is facing right now. I will ask to kickstart with a presentation. I have brought a few slides so that we can go through. So let me just put it. Let me share this. Okay. Can everybody see my slide? Yeah. So very challenging, restarting development under uncertainty. This is not about, at least I'm not focusing on specific ideas of intervention for entrepreneurs or policymakers, but this is the kickstart of a broader conversation, I would say. And of course, we can drill down based on the questions and what comes from the alumni from everywhere about of the planet. We can drill down on questions and on topics that are of interest. So we start by mentioning that global society already had lots of challenges, let's say at the end of 2019. So we were facing discussions and tricky questions throughout the planet. And then we just met with the virus. And the virus in the road comes from the short story from Mr. William Bennett called Stone in the Road, where the king once put a big rock in the middle of the road, and he was watching carefully to see who was going to tackle and move that stone out of the road for the welfare of everybody else. And many people would come by and just drive around or walk around the stone, and nobody would tackle with that challenge. But then came a small girl who was coming back to her home after a day of activities. And she was thinking, well, it's the end of the day, and now if I leave this rock here, maybe someone will come in the dark and then will not be able to see the stone and will get hurt. So she pushed very hard, and finally she could take the stone out of the road. And underneath the stone, there was a box. She found the box, and then came the king. The box was full of gold. And she was surprised. And the king said, well, for the one that would take the stone out of the way, here is a well-deserved box full of gold. So I hope by using this figure of speech, we can find during this road and moving these stones that are put in front of us now as a virus, we can find boxes of gold over there. And my approach for moving that rock, or for the big disruption that we are facing today in our planet, is that we're following a path of different stages or conditions. And this path starts with the confinement, the restrictions imposed or the shelter, the lockdown imposed to many people throughout the planet. That brings us to a moment of conflict, sometimes inside families, or new habits and tools. Some people also thriving with that and seizing the opportunity for other interests. But then it follows with the two simultaneous conditions. One is the collapse of businesses, of employment, of recession happening in the planet. But at the same time, a moment of considering and reflection, and of course, finding new opportunities that we can seize at this time. I put it very stressed over there that we should have, and I hope this is one of the kickstarts for that, we should have moments to conceive, to reflect based on skills and on knowledge on what should we compose for the next steps of the social, let's say, for the business arena, for the global society, and for our lives as a whole. So redesigning strategies and models and processes and new products will come. That is the result of the innovation. That is now the big opportunity that may be the box of gold underneath this stone. So how can we compose a new society based on this? This is not an utopian approach or like a romantic or let's say a dream for us. In my personal career, I have faced already many turbulences. Of course, there are situations that are regional, situations that are sector specific, and some that are more generic throughout the planet. But we have faced before, let's say from the year 2000 on, we have faced, for example, the internet bubble. And the internet bubble that shook the whole planet, the digital planet, telecom companies, internet companies, so on and so forth, was the trigger to kickstart one of the largest companies in the world today, which is Google. So this is to represent that even in darkness, we can create very interesting business models and solutions for the society. Coming back to 2000, fast forward to 2008 and 2009, we saw a whole new breed of companies popping up and being nurtured throughout the planet, like Uber, Airbnb, Dropbox, Spotify, and many others that happened to occur on that gap or vacuum or trigger of opportunity that represents. And the key, in my point of view, that should be nurtured for all of this is not, I mean, to bring enthusiasm or motivation for irresponsible entrepreneurship. We want to be conscious, we want to be innovative, we want to be prudent, but we want to be wise and enthusiastic about what is coming next. So strategy, planning, knowledge, those are the right direction to follow for this next step. And to represent that the key figure from my point of view that will be like the little girl that took the stone out of the way in this moment is the entrepreneur. And I bring here one mention from Professor Frank Knight. Frank Knight was one of the founding professors of Chicago School of Economics. But this was mentioned when he was writing his dissertation, PhD dissertation at Cornell University. And this is 1916, so 104 years ago. The entrepreneur is the one who acts now in face of uncertainties, aiming profits. Profits, of course, he defines in his book that are benefits that can be, of course, financial or in other circumstances, prestige or some other benefits that can be understood as profits. So being entrepreneurial is something that I would bet is the right direction to do, of course, facing with conscience all the constraints that we have today. So one also very important dimension that Professor Knight brought to us is the definition of uncertainties on a business perspective. So different than risk, uncertainty are occurrences that their probability cannot be measured. So risk is the part of the turbulence that you can measure, you can anticipate, and you can get prepared for it. Uncertainty is different. It is completely, I mean, surpriseful for your business plans. And then what kind of uncertainty we are facing today and what kind of transformations they will bring to us. So I come from a generation that is always talking about the new economy. My dissertation at the University of Brasilia back in 1994 was related to the digital impact in urban transportation. So you can imagine right now how interesting it is for me to see the world with the streets empty and people not moving around as we would last December, let's say. So that new economy now is changing to a new economy, where first countries or region are considering not only interdependency or autonomy, they are matching both concepts. We must bring together interlinked work and challenges so that we can cope as a global society. But at the same time, even regional governments are considering autonomy at this time. When we want to have, for example, masks for doctors in the hospitals, and many people throughout the world cannot reach out to them. Suppliers cannot deliver. Government regulations, from instantaneously prevented circulation of some of the goods that were needed. So I call the interdependent the balance between both worlds, autonomy and the interdependency to cope with the common challenges. The next one is the fast-paced world that we get in. And I've seen meetings and also in the academic world, for example, we have been discussing distance education for so long. And we saw that many things that happened in the last 2 months or even less than that were only a dream at the beginning of the year. So talking about big universities, large structures of education, reaching out to their public through digital platforms now. So accessing thousands, maybe millions of people in some situations. So the pace of change and the pace of implementation is much quicker nowadays. Also, the other driver is the contactless economy. So how can, and this is why we have this picture where the grandma in the figure cannot embrace her grandkids on the other side of the picture. So how can we cope with a new economy that contact personal services, retail, service providing like healthcare or even education that I mentioned, will not anymore allow the same level of contact person to person that we had before. And the fourth point is related to security. So there are many issues about security, and we saw reports in these last few weeks showing how there was an increase on threats on cybersecurity throughout the planet during these last couple of months. So cybersecurity becomes central. Cybersecurity becomes one of the top issues for the first interdependent world that we're talking about, because we're talking about sovereignty in many aspects, but also we're talking about continuity for the society through security online. Security online also becomes an issue for safety of the population in many cases. So those four drivers should be the drivers helping us to define what comes next. So from there, there are topics that could be addressed, and I guess we can drill down on them based on the questions that come from the audience. But questions that are urgently emerging nowadays, I try to consolidate on those topics, are first of all, inclusiveness policies. We see many situations, and Latin America, we have plentiful of examples of those, that local societies that would never look at the less favored part of the society are now encouraging inclusiveness policies that would engage and bring platforms. And I'm not only talking about solidarity, I'm talking about bringing up a new way of living for people that if they would not be engaged in a productive way into the society, they will become a risk, they will become a surge or a problem to the whole society. So inclusiveness. Another point that I see gaining momentum is the scale-up policy sentiment that is needed. So growing businesses is not done, by nature or by luck. That is also part of a well-planned strategy that would be the tissue. And Professor Moacir has had very rich discussions with me before about that. Scaling up policies can be the differentiator between successful and the failure of national economies as a whole. So how to eliminate the burden of growth from companies that are nurtured in local societies. Of course, the services.
I don't want to interrupt you, but you have 5 more minutes. It's just that we have.
Yeah, I need 2 minutes. Yeah,
that's perfect.
So services policies also, there are plentiful of discussions over there. So we're now talking about services on digital proximity instead of the contact economy. We're now talking about digital proximity. So what kind of transformations we need in education, in healthcare, in logistics, so on and so forth, in many services areas, financial services, so on and so forth. And the trade policies, of course, countries tend to become more active on regulating trade in periods like this, but we must balance resilience of the local economies at the same time with efficiency. So we saw a very strong growth in the past decades towards Asia, talking about global supply chains. That should be rebalanced also with resilience, but it can't be like a binary discussion. It should be balanced. That is my pitch over there. And of course, the mindset. So there are challenges for emerging markets. There are challenges for Asia, for Europe that are specific, but the mindset of coexistence is very important. My last slide is a call then, from my point of view, for once again, the entrepreneurs, but as leaders. So it's a call for integrity, for cohesion, and for purpose. So we need desperately empathic leadership throughout the planet. Brazil is a key example of that, and what we're living through the last few years in this country is something unimaginable in that sense. But this is my pitch, and for the alumni engaged in this presentation today, I would suggest first to be humble, learn how to listen. So in this kind of fast-paced economy and so many things going on a daily basis, it's impossible for you to know everything. So you can't know everything. So be humble and listen to the colleagues, to the cohort. Second, be open, be transparent, be clear on your communication and show exactly what you're thinking about so that you can get the right feedback on that. And third, be engaged. So embrace a noble purpose. You have to have the right direction, the right vision to pursue, and then you commit to that. You uphold the flag, you work with compassion, with decency, and achieve consequence. With that, I would conclude. Professor Ann, handle it back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Humberto, and thank you also for this humble, open, and engaged leadership that you are basically advocating. I think we need it all over the world. I will now give the floor to Timothy Heyman, who will take a different perspective in some way, and will look more at finance and globalization and the context of the crisis from a Mexican perspective. But before that, I will introduce Timothy, who is at the present president of Franklin Templeton Asset Management Mexico. And before that, Timothy was a leading investment manager in Mexico, managing funds for large enterprises, but also multinational, but also multinationals, and also for non-profit organizations, including the healthcare sector. And actually was president of the largest hospital in Mexico, and I understand that through present time he's also involved in some tasks to take care of some of the problems raised by the COVID crisis. And among his, Timothy has a very rich career with a long experience, largely, of course, and asset management. He was, among others, president of the first brokerage firm in Mexico, and he founded Heyman & Associates, which was also a key investment manager company. He has also been member of a number of boards, and interestingly, that's why also I suppose you will see his kind of academic approach. He has written a number of books on finance and globalization. The last one was in November 2018, it was published. It was entitled Finance, Time and Growth, Theory, Evidence, and Conclusion for Mexico, and was actually published in cooperation with EMI. And I will also conclude by saying that Timothy had the honor to be appointed by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth as Commander of the British Empire for a recognition of his service to the UK and Mexican finance, investment, and philanthropy. Timothy, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Anne. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Right, thank you very much, Anne. It really is a privilege and a pleasure to be in this webinar. Thank you also, Lourdes, who invited me to Cornell from the beginning. Thank you, Vanita, for organizing this. And it's an honor to be with Humberto, Luiz on this seminar. Now, I think the title is brilliant, the idea of restarting development under uncertainty. Now, we had the chance to chat before this seminar, and I think the way in which I will speak in a form that's complementary to Humberto's, he's talking about the sailor in the boat, that they should be ready to know what to do in what's happening, and obviously he's implying that this is a huge change. Now, I will do the complementary thing, which is I'm talking about the sea and the climate and the geography in which they're going to have to face. In fact, I will now start my screen. I don't know what's happened to my screen. Excuse me 1 second. Here it is, okay. Can you all see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Okay, well, so within this context then of, and this is actually not a short presentation, it's several slides, which will be made available in PDF, but I will talk fast.
Yeah,
but I
15 minutes.
Sorry?
15 minutes.
Right, I will talk fast, but I hope so. But I will trip over, it's mostly graphs, but the 1 or 2 things with prose, which I will basically, the first quote is from the head of the World Health Organization, that we're not just fighting an epidemic, we're fighting an infodemic. This in itself implies ignorance, uncertainty. What he's talking about. Now we're talking about the biggest global health, economic, and financial crisis that we've ever faced in our lifetimes, and it's at its peak. It's the worst pandemia since the Spanish flu. Within this context, Mexico is a typical emerging market in that context. It's also the biggest economic crisis since 1930, in the sense we're going to have the worst recession, -3%. Now, the issue we're both talking about, Humberto, is about the reopening of the economies. And I'm going to talk about the view that there'll be a recovery in the second semester. But there are 3 ways which this could occur, which are, it could be either a V or a U or an L. Okay, now very quickly, I'm going to talk about the 3 areas of the, one is the pandemic itself, then the economy, then the markets. Now, very importantly, the markets actually aren't only a consequence of the first 2 elements, which are but they're also can tell us what's going on. They're the best kind of information processor, and I'll be telling you how and why. Now, very quickly, this is what's going on in the world. This is as of yesterday. The world, we've got 2.6 million cases. We've got 186,000 deaths. Brazil, Mexico, now both highly underdeveloped. Why? The one interesting thing is that they've got the fewer deaths per population, as you see in the next thing, 14 Brazil and 8. But we also have an unbelievably low number of tests per population. We're ranked number 76 and number 87 in the terms of, we have under-institutionalized governments reflected in our healthcare system. Okay, now Mexico, the information we have is apparently we're not doing too badly, but we really don't know what's going on. And it's possibly the same with Brazil. We have no cases because we have no tests. It's a very simple way of solving the problem. Okay, what do we know about COVID? Well, this is what we know, just talking about the uncertainty. We think it lasts 2 to 3 months. We think the curve is flattened. We think mortality depends on the percent of old people, socioeconomic level, because you can distance socially if you're rich, you can't if you're poor. And that there are more cases in the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. And interestingly, the difference between emerging markets and developed markets is the healthcare failings of countries like Mexico and maybe Brazil are offset by apparently our beneficial climate and demography. Right, now, the other thing we have is like an end date of the storm that the sailor is about to set sail in, as it represented by entrepreneurs like Humberto. We know there's an end date, which is 18 months, which everybody says there'll be a vaccine, but meanwhile, what's going to be happening, that's what I'm going to talk about. Okay, well, we know that there are all these different medicines in the pipeline of tests and cures and vaccines. We had the disappointment yesterday of one, but they're announced some another. Now, the tests and cures could happen at any time, but the vaccine, we do have an end date. And that tells us where we are, at least in time, not where we are in space, but where we are in time. Now, it's an interesting fact, we've got a relationship between the lockdown and lack of growth. Next, we actually have now, we can talk about specific programs per country. Each of these countries has already announced that they're reopening, and you can have time to read this, but in different ways and with different rules, very specific rules. Denmark opened its primary schools at the beginning of this week. In Mexico, they claimed that we're going to open our schools in June. Trump states that 21 states will open in the United States. Every country has their, but we'll have to, this is the point of the geography and the wind. We have to be very careful of what's going on. Okay, the next thing, which is a very interesting thing, which was produced for the United States, is a timeline of how, and basically the US is talking about basing its reopening on testing. It's got a huge, they've tested about 6 million people. And so on the basis of immunity, they think they can open on the basis of tests. Okay, we go straight on to the economy. I tell you, I would be quick. What's very important is the biggest reflation or contracyclical package which has ever been announced in the history of the world in the face of any crisis. This has been learned from obviously the Depression. In fact, Ben Bernanke was a pioneer when he was the head of the Fed. He'd studied the Depression, so there was a huge reflationary monetary package, but not fiscal. But this time with this, got this incredible combination of $8 billion of finance, $9 billion, 17.9, 20% of the global economy. This is the most extraordinary. And I really think this should avert a depression, i.e. the L shape. Now, we look at Mexico, because I'm using it as a typical emerging market. Mexico has a stimulus package of 0.3%. We'll talk about politics in a second, but you'll see that Brazil is doing rather well, and I'm sure Humberto can talk. 10% of the most important countries, Peru, Brazil, and Chile are doing pretty well, but Mexico is extremely bad. Now, we just announced 2 days ago, after I'd prepared this document, monetary package of 3% of GDP. So at least we're above Guatemala, but that's all we can claim. A very bad pro-cyclical package, not a contra-cyclical package. Now here we have the World Bank estimates for the economy. And frankly, this is the best case scenario. It's only -3%, which is the worst world economic performance since 1938. And then a recovery of 5.8%. You'll see down below Brazil and Mexico, they're in blue, appropriately a blue color for Brazil and a green color for Mexico. More or less similar economic, -5, -6%. That is actually, frankly, the best case scenario. And China, not with negative growth, with positive growth, because it fell in fell in the first quarter, and then that it will cover. Okay, so we then look at Mexico. Now, this is where governance is very important. We have a man who has his own vision of the future, which he's held. Now, he's not an economic, and he's a politician, and he has his vision of Mexico, which is called the Fourth Transformation. And it's based on an idea of effectively the government running anything, and he thinks that neoliberalism, which is what has brought to where we are, is the wrong recipe. He thinks we should go back to effectively statist policies. Now, nobody denies that his complaints about the political system in Mexico are correct. There's too much corruption, there's too little equality, and there's too much poverty. But we think that he has the wrong recipes. You can read all this stuff. So Now we'll move on to the fact is that what he's been doing in the face of this health crisis, he's put in healthcare policies too little, too late, and with too little information. He may be saved by the climate and the demography, but he has done too little, too late, and his economic program is exactly the wrong opposite of what should be done. I mean, what has happened then as a result of this is his popularity has fallen. You can see on the right-hand side that the opinion of his capacity is the lowest it's ever been. It's also led to his party being, for the first time, got a popularity of only 18%. And this is, there are going to be elections next year. And what I think is that, in fact, because he wants to get elected, he may do the right thing and start spending more money. We had the independent central bank putting in this program, but we may have a stimulus package as well because he wants to get re-elected. Right, we then have three scenarios of these are the risks, which I've talked about. Now, the best scenario is where the best things happen. The worst and the best policies and the best things happen. The worst scenario is where the worst, and almost always it's never either the best or the worst, it's the middle. So I will simply skip through these pages and then you can read this afterwards. But I think it's the middle one, which is nothing ever is the best or the worst, it's somewhere in the middle. And this is where all the things which Humberto talks about, of someone who knows what he's doing, he can figure out his way around the rocks and through the storms, through the shells, and through the winds. But this is what the people have to figure out. So now on the markets, what are they telling us? Well, the worst performing currencies are Brazil and Mexico. How interesting. Why? Because we have this combination of events and we have very erratic politicians running our country. Plus, Mexico has the most liquid currency. Now the peso, this is what the market tells you is at its worst level since the tequila crisis in 1994. And this is, I think, sentiment is at its lowest. We're at the peak of the crisis in medical terms. We're at the lowest level in market terms. This is what the market is telling us. You've got to know how to know what systems of measurement and how to read them. Again, the nautical metaphor is not a bad one. Then looking at investments, again, for the first time, I don't know if it was the same in Brazil, but normally because of higher risk, you made more money investing in pesos, even converted into dollars. This time, no, you now made more money in dollars. And so everything it looks like, when this happens, normally the peso, it's now at 25 pesos, it's incredibly low. I think that unless, obviously, if this president carries on as president, I think he may be forced not to, but everything is at an extremely low level of valuation in Mexico. Look at what's been going on in our markets. Mexican markets have been very bad. And this is a confidence indicator. This has never happened since 2001. We've got negative outlook of 93%, positive outlook of 3%. And this has never happened in the last 20 years. I'm saying the indicators are at their lowest evaluation. And I think that's a very important fact to bear in mind. Luego, the debt, this shows that interest rates since the year 3000 BC, I like history, are at their lowest level ever, which gives room for maneuver, or it means there's not much room left in terms of monetary, but we've now learned more about how to print money and how to use central banks than ever before. Then Mexico is currently investment grade, but it's teeter on the brink of falling to a downgrade. Pemex is doing very badly because it's slightly separated from the government, not as well as Petrobras. Very quickly, also the foreign share of investments has fallen from 38% of debt to 26%. If there were to be a downgrade, which currently there's at least a 50-50 chance, even though Mexico yesterday issued $6 billion worth of bonds, because it's on investment grade and is paying 5%, which is a lot of money. I think that, again, the markets are probably betting that the government will be forced to do the right thing because it will have no option. But if there were to be a downgrade, we would immediately lose another $26 billion. But we do have these huge reserves when we have an IMF credit, which could save us. If you look at the outflows, they're below what we did in the year 2008. Okay, well, stocks. Well, in the world, in America, which isn't doing too badly, when the American support, I'm about to finish, support programs run out, the markets rose, but Mexico has not done well. There's a very interesting difference between emerging markets and development. The developed markets are in blue. Why? Because they have more institutionalization in healthcare and economics and finance. And the markets reflect the reality. Very, very interesting. I'm almost saying there were outflows from emerging markets of $100 billion. The S&P has fallen and gone up. The Mexican market has fallen but not gone up. The valuations are the valuations in Mexico are even lower than America because of but the valuations are very low. We're at the peak of the crisis, but for the lower level. If somebody wants to start taking risk, our view is that if they really think we're going to get now, if they think the IMF scenario is the right one, the time is to take. We frankly predicted this crash not because of the coronavirus, but because of the debt buildup in the world. So we're positioned very conservatively. So on very conservative portfolios, we're prepared to put our foot back in the water, not necessarily in Mexico, but in America. But so those are the valuations. The last thing is real estate trusts in Mexico, which are offering very high. So that's it. So that's all I have to say. I hope it was clear, and very happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Timothy. It was extremely, very, very detailed and very, very informative. So now I will give the floor to Moacir, who is going to handle the question. But again, thanks very much to Humberto and a lot also to Timothy.
Thank you very much, Humberto. Thank you very much, Timothy. I like it. I like that very much. Humberto, it's a great pleasure meeting you again. I want to remember that in 2017 we organized a seminar at the University of São Paulo. And the title of the seminar was the Scale Up Bootcamp Seminar. But the main question of the seminar was, why don't we have unicorns in Brazil? Brazil is usually a top 10 largest economy among the top 10 largest economy in the world for decades. But just after 1 year, we started to see the first unicorns in the country. So great pleasure meeting you again. Okay, we have some questions, and I want to take advantage, sorry for doing that, of organizing the session to do the first question. And it's a very simple and right to the point. My question is in your opinion, what's the role of the state during this crisis and after this crisis? State government.
Whom is the question addressed?
My point is there are a lot of, in Brazil, we have a big discussion on the role of the state, the size of the state, if you need state, at this very moment, we can see the state is playing a crucial role in defining the politics to fight against the coronavirus. So my point is what can we expect for the role of the state during this crisis and mainly after the crisis? For example, some people is talking about a Marshall Plan or restructuring, the construction of the world economy and this kind of stuff. And what do you think on this?
So if I may, Tim, because you may not, the sound doesn't go too well. Well, first, please try to remove your stop sharing at the top of the screen so that okay, perfect. So then, Tim, the question is very clear about the role of the state and the government. In this crisis, we see that the governments are coming back and having a very important role all over. So yeah, that's the question.
Okay, I think it's a wonderful question. I think this extraordinary differentiation, this is why it's so interesting seeing this from emerging markets perspective, between developed countries and non-developed countries. I think, and in fact, the Americans, despite their president, had this extraordinary ability to come together with a bipartisan, extraordinary fiscal program. Forget about the Federal Reserve. I think the Federal Reserve learned a huge amount in the 2008 crisis, but the fiscal stimulus package is very extraordinary. So as government, they did very well. I think there have been other responses, I think, in Germany, in France, in England, and I think the Europeans, they've had a problem of getting their act together, but I think also the Chinese government has worked well. I think each of you, I think Humberto could talk to Brazil. I think there is an issue of coordination between the countries. There was this meeting and this virtual meeting organized by Saudi Arabia. I think that it is true, I think implicit in the way the question was put, I think a reorganization through the group of 7 or the group of 20 of the role of the World Bank and the IMF in the face of this thing. Clearly, there is a role for them to figure out ways of coordination in the face of this crisis. There can be a kind of playbook in terms of the methods of monetary stimulus and fiscal stimulus, and then of health coordination. I think that's very true. I think there is a role to play in terms of in the future of what happened in the crisis and what went wrong, and the way in which different governments reacted in different ways. Ironically, the Asians knew more about it because they had the SARS. And then afterwards, maybe a reorganization of the World Health Organization and the IMF and the World Bank in the face of this whole post-COVID thing. I think it's a very good question. I think Humberto's worked in government could probably answer it better.
First to agree with him, I guess that we have two perspectives on public policy. So first is the short term. Of course, we're living through a turbulence. So the fiscal and the healthcare agendas, they are the key drivers right now. So, and I guess Tim has addressed that. But my concern also relies on the middle to long-term agenda. So as it was also mentioned before, Latin America in special, we're still living through a demographic bonus. And going into a new fast-paced economy, digital economy, contactless economy, how can you cope with the future without preparing your people for that? So I guess on that second perspective, the key issue will be on education, massive, pervasive, how to let people, and also at the same time, we're facing, you know, this huge issue related to fake news. So how can you let your people engage into a productive and fruitful educational agenda? So the tools and the content and the means to allow people to access that is, for me, one key driver for prosperity in the future. So even further than it has ever been from generation to generation before. At the same time, we're still talking about agendas for the short term on a financial lending to entrepreneurs. But then maybe Tim can help us with this. So I guess during this time, we should also be taking a look as similar to other countries. I refer to Denmark, for example. that froze the economy. That's the term that they used. So how can you grant money to the right people so that you can, as soon as the wave of infection passes, you can restart the economy as it was before, but of course paying attention to the new drivers. And in that sense, the key issue for the long term, of course, is when are we going to have the vaccine? If ever we're going to have the vaccine at some point.
18 months.
Yeah, so if we're having a vaccine, it's one thing. If we're not having a vaccine, what kind of world are we going to live, you know, starting maybe in a couple of months? So public policy needs to address and balance all of that. But for sure, my bet is on education, pervasive, rich, fully of content, right content to the people.
Thank you, Humberto. Thank you very much. There is Annabella Rosario presents a question for Timothy, but I think that I can expand this question to Humberto as well. The question is that, do you consider that there is any international institution that can pressure the Mexican government to change its economic and health policy? So I think it is.
That's a good question. I think, actually, I spoke on a webinar the other day. Apparently, the only person who has influence over our president is Donald Trump. When we just had the problem with OPEC about a week ago, the man who solved the problem with our president was Donald Trump. I think we have to channel everything through Donald Trump. Sorry, that's a slightly facetious answer, but he's the one person who apparently seems to have, also when we had the migration problem way back when, and he sent down his son-in-law and everything, but I think that the pressure can come through the Americans. And I think also we are a tremendous ally. This is a very big point. The whole, I've got two separate points, but I'll make the first point, which is that I think the whole, this is the culmination of globalization, the winners of globalization with China and so on, and then the product of globalization was coronavirus and so on. But the supply chains dependent on China have been broken. The obvious place is Mexico. So Trump needs Mexico, and Mexico needs, well, America needs Mexico. This is the relationship which I think could, and I think the people, those of us who are prepared to bet on Mexico, and I wouldn't rule us out. If you look at the IMF projections, they're fairly optimistic in the face of, in fact, mostly because of, we have this tremendous chaotic political situation where just yesterday, there was an initiative by the ruling party called Moreno that they should nationalize the pension fund system, which is a parallel fund system to the private money management system, that it should be run through the welfare bank. But this was just came out and everybody got very scared. And then the head of Morena said, no, it's not on the agenda. But when all these things are happening, nobody knows if they're planted by the president, or when you live in this kind of, the word uncertainty is a wonderful word. This puts people very, very nervous. So most people are possibly less optimistic than I may be sounding in this country. Carry on, sorry.
Thank you, Timothy. I think we finish our time, but I'd like to present the one last question. The question by Miroux, and is asking about the impact of the crisis on global value chains, and if could Mexico and Brazil benefit from a change in global value chains, in opposition to China, of course.
Let Humberto start, please.
I would say, once again, there's a balance between resilience and effectiveness. So there are some competitive advantages with the rise of China, that in many situations, and if you're not talking about priorities, if you're not talking about supply chains, that the local content can be relevant in times of crisis, then that kind of supply chains will continue to, the center of gravity continues to be China in that sense. And then just pointing that I'm focusing on effectiveness of the supply chain. But at the same time, when the whole world, for example, is facing a bottleneck for masks or for gloves for doctors to use, amidst a crisis like this, a healthcare crisis like this, then many things, come back as food for thought for policymakers regarding local content. So in many situations, you will need to rebalance to the other side. So I guess it depends. Brazil today has a sense, and I'm not one of the believers on that. I think that Brazil has a very rich potential on the agribusiness. That's where my family comes from. That's my origin on the business sector. But at the same time, agribusiness is not all. So if we're facing a new economy, contactless, digital, interdependent, we must tackle, the higher end sectors of activity that Brazil also must consolidate internally as a domestic production capability. So, I mean, it will depend, it will vary from area to area, and we should balance on that.
Thank you.
From my point of view, I think the COVID crisis is in fact the culmination of globalization, which is a product of technology and open frontiers. And I think that really what it represents is society catching up with technology, because I think technology drives history. And obviously what happened was when technology was ahead of society, you got the protest of the people who were left aside by technology. So you got populism, and now populism has kind of reached a peak, and hopefully it'll be realized that globalization can be both good and bad. We're living the bad consequences, the disease, and now they'll realize that technology is the solution, and will come back. And within that thing is that economic logic will prevail, the business of the supply chain. In fact, the person who is giving the wrong signals is our president. I didn't have a chance to mention that he'd canceled a $900 million brewery, which is, $1.4 billion brewery on the frontier, which had already invested $900 million, and nobody knows why. And then he spoke against wind farms because they were anti. So he's giving the wrong signals. But I'm saying again, will reality impose itself? I think this should happen in the rest of the world, and it may well happen here. But in the end, it's obvious that Mexico stands to benefit in the same way in which Humberto is saying, supply chains, also education. I think there's also a tremendous pushback from the emerging middle class in Mexico. The problem is it hasn't yet fully emerged, but there's a tremendous pushback in the press with the educated people. In those graphs, you'll see the educated people, obviously, and places like the Tec de Monterrey leaders. So, and this is, as it were, the ultimate stress test of globalization. And I think it's worth betting on the idea that we will resist it, but it's clear that what we have to do, and this is basically the point of my talk, we have to follow every little point in all this roadmap to see which road leads where, and see what are the good signals and what are the bad signals. But I think there's a reasonable chance that we will pass this stress test.
Thank you very much. As Tim said, we have one of the most global webinars ever. Brazil, Mexico, the most important economies in Latin America, the ones that make it or break it, the region. So you need to recover, you need to restart development ASAP, because not only for your own countries, but for the rest. We had Colombia, Argentina, Europe. So definitely, I also wanted to thank Mavi, who is the technical support within the team. Really excellent. Everything went extremely well. So very insightful, very interesting, very forward-looking, giving hope. That's what we all need, and mainly the young generation needs that. So thank you, Humberto, Ribeiro. Thank you very much, Timothy, Heyman. Excellent presentations. And I would like to pass the word to Diego and Anabela, who are going to be in charge of the next webinar on May 8th.